So which function could we write? Well, let's say we want to make sure that at some point of time in this module, we can click the plus button and add whatever we entered here to our current result, which initially is 0. And then if we type 5 here and click plus, we want to get 5. So the new result is then 5. If I thereafter type 10 and I click plus, we would get 15, right? So that would be an idea to get started with. And for that, we need a function, or we could add a function that does just that, that adds two numbers. So for that, we can define a function, and it's up to you where you do that. You can actually do it kind of at the start of your script, maybe below your variable definitions, or you can actually also do it at the end of your script, and JavaScript is smart enough to kind of read your entire file before it executes it, and it will therefore find any functions you use so that it then automatically pulls these functions to the top, so to say. So that if you define a function down there, but you then use it somewhere above its definition, you can still execute that code without an error. Something which, by the way, is not possible for variables and constants you defined with let and const. But I'll come back to this in a second. For now, let's just add a function here, let's say, and let's name it add, and you can pick any name you want here. The idea for the name here just should be that it describes the action this function will perform. So if it's a function that adds two numbers, something like add or add numbers makes sense instead of give me two numbers, which describes what it wants to get as an input, but not what it does. You also don't want to have something like result as a name, because what does this function do? It doesn't tell us anything. It gives us some result, sure, but for which operation? So here add sounds like a fitting name. It makes it clear that this is a function which will do some addition. And then, as I said, a function can but doesn't have to take parameters. Now in JavaScript, and you'll see that throughout the course, of course, there are functions which work without any input. Let's say you have a function which kind of reads something from the HTML page. This probably doesn't take any input because inside of the function you have all the information you need to kind of reach out to the HTML page and get some data from there. On the other hand, a function which should add two numbers probably needs these two numbers which it should add. So we should provide two parameters here. And you can give these parameters any name you want. So I will go with num1 and num2, but you could go with a and b, or with number1 and number2, or whatever you want. These parameters which you define here are then available in the so-called function body, which is the last missing piece on this function. You add the function body by adding curly braces here, like this. And now important, after the function you don't have a semicolon. Now you could add one, but typically you don't do that. You add a semicolon after all these one-line expressions here, but after a statement, as this is called, which includes such curly braces like this one does here, you don't add a semicolon. You can just keep this in mind. Whenever you have some curly braces with some code, some executable code in between, you don't have a semicolon after the curly braces. Whenever you have these short expressions here, you have a semicolon at the end. So here we have a function, keyword, name, parameters, which are optional, and then the function body. And now in the function body, you can do all kinds of things. For example, we can define a constant in here as well, maybe name this result, and just add num1 and num2 here. Now num1 and num2 are like variables, though they're never defined with the let or const keyword, but they're automatically defined by JavaScript, but they're only available inside of this function body, not outside. So if I would try to do something with num1 here, after the function definition, this would not work because num1 and num2 are variables only available inside of the function body. Now I use them here to add them together because I expect this function to be called such that whatever I get here on num1 and num2 are numbers, and therefore adding them works. And I store the result in a new constant. Now the interesting thing here is that this constant is defined inside of the function, not at the top level of our script. And that's something you can do in JavaScript, and that is actually quite normal. You can have variables and constants here at the top level of your script. This is also called in the global scope, but you can also have them inside of your function. And it's actually important where you define that, and I'll come back to that. For now, I want to calculate a result, which I only use inside of the function, and therefore we can declare and define this variable, or this constant actually, inside of that function. Now, inside of that function body, you see that my IDE automatically indents the code, which means it's not totally on the left here, but there is some empty space. This is done for readability. Technically, this is not required. Your code would run even if this would all be written in one line. So if you would move that right next to the curly braces and have that all defined in one line. But having the function split out across multiple lines and having this indentation, this empty space, simply helps with reading or understanding your function. Now, regarding the amount of empty space you have to the left, you can find a lot of discussions about that on the internet. Now here, I indented by 4 blanks, so to say, so 4 white spaces. Now you'll find discussions on the internet whether you want to use 4 or 2, whether you want to use tabs or white space. I'm a fan of white space, and I'll typically use 2. Also later, when I auto-format my document, it's configured to use 2 white spaces here instead of 4 as I have it right now. You can go with whichever approach you want. You then should just stick to it and be consistent. And you can also configure your code styling, your code formatting plugin for the IDE you're using to format your code according to your preferences. Again, my tool will later change this to 2 blanks here instead of 4 as I have it right now. You can go for either of that. You just should write readable code in the end. So this will now hold the result of num1 and num2 added together. And now what can we do with the result? Well, we can, for example, output it with the alert function. This is a function built into JavaScript or built into the browser and provided to you in JavaScript executed in the browser. So we don't need to define this function on our own to call it. It's available. It's one of the built-in functions. And there are a couple of built-in functions in JavaScript. It depends on whether you're running JavaScript in the browser or outside of the browser. But here we're in the browser, and there we have something like the alert function, which is, well, built in, made available by the browser. So alert then allows us to output a message. We could say the result is, and then this is a string, of course, add result here. And of course, you could have also used the backticks notation with this $ curly brace embedding here. Now, I do create a string here where I concatenate my result because alert actually wants a message as a parameter. And you can see this if you hover over alert in Visual Studio Code. You see this is a function, again, provided by JavaScript or by the browser. And this wants a message parameter. We can ignore the question mark for now. That simply means that providing this message is optional. So you could throw an alert without a message, which is kind of pointless though. And message here is a parameter which actually, well, should be a string because you want to output some text typically. So now I'm outputting this text here, this alert. Now if I save this and we reload, nothing happens. We see no alert. And the reason for that is that we're not calling this function yet. As I mentioned, you need to call a function in order for it to be executed. Now, how do you call a function? Well, you can just use the function name. So in this case, add. And if you picked a different name, you have to pick a different name here. And then add parentheses like this. So a bit like you defined it here, but without the function keyword and without the body. Because this defines what's inside of the function, how it works. This now calls the function. And here I add a semicolon again, because here I don't have the curly braces, I don't define the function here, I just execute this as a so-called expression. So I just have this line of code which is executed. This line of code is also executed, but it's executed such that this code is registered and stored by JavaScript. So it kind of is made aware of this function. This line then executes and calls that function. It runs that function. Now this function, to work correctly, needs 2 parameters, also called arguments. It needs a number 1 and a number 2. And now here, of course, you don't provide num1 or num2, so you don't repeat these names. These are just internal names for these automatically created variables you can use inside of the function. Instead, here you now provide the concrete values that the function should use for running. So something like 1 and 2 if you want to add 1 and 2 together. So now num1 would be set to 1 and num2 would be set to 2 for this function execution. And as I said, you can now run a function multiple times by executing it again, with 5 and 5, for example. Now we would execute the function 2 times, one with a value of 1 for num1 and a value of 2 for num2. And then the second time we run it, we pass in a value of 5 for num1 and a value of 5 for num2. And now if we save that and we reload this file, you see, since this script runs right away, we get the alert with the result is 3, because here I'm, well, calling this function with 1 and 2. And if I click OK, I right away get another alert, because we're running this function twice, and script execution is kind of blocked by the alert, which is why the second alert waits until we dismiss the first alert. And in that second alert, I see the result is 10, because I called this function with 5 and 5. And if I dismiss, well, then we see that page being rendered. So this is how we define a function and how we call it in JavaScript. Now I will emphasize again that a function can have as many parameters as it needs if it needs to have some. You can have 1 parameter, 2 as we have it here, 3, 5, 4, as many as you want. And a function can also do one other thing, which we're not doing here. It can return something.